I still remember the moment my husband called me a freeloader in court. Not in private, not in an argument behind closed doors, but out loud, in front of a judge, lawyers, and a room full of strangers. I stood there, hands trembling slightly, while his attorney calmly explained how I had lived off his family, how I had never earned a real income, how I was nothing more than a financial burden disguised as a wife. My husband, Daniel, didn't stop them. His parents nodded along, as if this was the truth they had been waiting years to say out loud. People whispered. Someone laughed quietly, and I stayed silent. Because inside my bag was a folder no one had seen. Inside that folder was my real income. And when the judge finally read it aloud, every single face in that courtroom went pale. My name is Emma Carter, and for most of my marriage, I was invisible in every way that mattered. To the world, I wasn't Emma. I was Daniel's wife. At family gatherings, that's how his parents introduced me. This is our son's wife. Never my name, never my work. Just a role, carefully defined and quietly diminished. Daniel came from a family that believed money was the loudest proof of worth. His father, Richard Carter, owned part of a construction company. His mother, Linda, never missed a chance to remind everyone how hard-working their family was. They liked people who fit neatly into their expectations. I never did. At dinners, Richard would lean back in his chair and ask with a half-smile, "So, Emma, are you still working from home?" The pause always mattered more than the question. Linda would jump in before I could answer. "She's creative," she'd say gently. "You know how those things are." Creative. That word followed me everywhere. It sounded harmless, but it wasn't. It meant unreliable. It meant not serious. It meant someone we don't need to take seriously. Daniel never defended me. If anything, he laughed it off. "She likes her laptop," he'd say, "as long as she's happy." But happiness had nothing to do with it. I worked every day, long hours, quiet hours. I built something piece by piece while sitting at the same table where they assumed I was doing nothing. Yet in their eyes, if I wasn't leaving the house in a suit at 8 in the morning, I wasn't really working. Over time, the jokes stopped sounding like jokes. The looks became sharper, the questions more pointed. I started to feel like I had to prove my existence just to justify being in the room, and without realizing it, I had already been placed into a box. The box they would later label, without hesitation, Freeloader. What Daniel's family never asked was the simplest question of all. What do you actually do all day? They assumed they already knew the answer. While Daniel left the house every morning with his keys and briefcase, I stayed behind. Not because I had nothing to do, but because my work didn't need an office, a uniform, or an audience. I ran a small consulting business under a private LLC, helping healthcare clinics streamline their financial systems. It was technical, quiet work, the kind that didn't make for interesting dinner conversation. I worked early mornings and late nights, sometimes 12 hours straight. My laptop was always open, spreadsheets glowing while the house slept. But because my work didn't look like theirs, it didn't count. One evening, after a tense dinner with his parents, Daniel finally said what they had all been thinking. "You know," he muttered, loosening his tie, "my parents worry about us." I didn't look up from my screen. "About what?" "About the fact that I'm carrying most of the weight," he said. "They think you don't really contribute." I felt something tighten in my chest. "Do you think that?" He hesitated. Just a second too long. "I mean," he said carefully, "you're always busy, but nothing ever seems tangible." Tangible. Another word that sounded harmless but cut deep. I closed my laptop slowly. "Do you want to see my accounts?" Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "If you were making real money, Emma, I'd know." That was the moment I understood something painful and clear. They didn't want transparency. They wanted control. So I stopped offering explanations. I paid my share quietly. I invested quietly. I saved quietly. When Daniel's parents insisted on covering something, I let them because refusing only fueled their narrative. To them, generosity was leverage, and they loved holding it over me. "You're lucky," Linda once said sweetly. "Not every woman gets taken care of like this." I smiled and thanked her, even as my stomach twisted. What none of them knew was that my income had already surpassed Daniel's, that my name alone was on my contracts, that every dollar I earned was clean, legal, and documented. I kept it private not because I was ashamed, but because I was protecting myself. And looking back now, I realized that silence wasn't weakness. It was preparation. Because one day, all that quiet work would speak for me, in the only place they couldn't interrupt. A courtroom. The end of my marriage didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, wrapped in cold politeness and legal language. Daniel told me he wanted a divorce on a Tuesday night, his voice calm, almost rehearsed. "This isn't working anymore," he said. "We're just too different." I nodded, even though my hands were shaking. Part of me had known it was coming. What I didn't expect was how quickly his family stepped in. Within days, his parents were involved in every decision. Lawyers were hired. Conversations stopped being about separation and started being about strategy. The first time we sat across from each other in the lawyer's office, Linda clasped her hands and sighed dramatically. "We just want what's fair." Richard leaned forward. "And we want to make sure our son isn't taken advantage of." I felt my throat tighten. "Taken advantage of how?" Daniel answered for them. "Emma, let's be honest. You've been depending on my family for years." I stared at him. "That's not true." He shrugged. "Then prove it." By the time we reached court, the narrative had already been written. Daniel's attorney stood confidently, flipping through a neat stack of papers. "Your Honor, Mrs. Carter has no stable, verifiable income. Throughout the marriage, she relied heavily on the Carter family for housing, expenses, and lifestyle support." Linda nodded at the judge, eyes shining with what looked like concern. "We supported her like a daughter," Richard added bluntly. "She never brought in real money." When Daniel took the stand, he didn't look at me. "She worked from home," he said, "but I never saw consistent income. My parents paid for most things." The word freeloader hung in the air, unspoken but loud. I felt heat rise in my face as whispers rippled through the courtroom. People looked at me with a mixture of pity and judgment. I could almost hear what they were thinking. Another woman living off her husband. The judge turned toward me. "Mrs. Carter, do you dispute this characterization?" I opened my mouth, closed it again. "Yes," I said finally. "But I'd like to respond when it's my turn." Daniel's lawyer smiled, confident. "Of course." They thought I was stalling. They thought I had nothing. But as I sat back down, my fingers brushed against my bag. Inside it was the evidence they believed didn't exist. And for the first time since the divorce began, I felt something unexpected rise through the fear. Not anger. Not panic. Certainty. Because this was no longer just about a marriage ending. This was about my name, and I was done letting them define it. The courtroom felt smaller with every passing minute. Daniel's lawyer continued, laying out their version of my life as if it were a settled fact. Charts appeared on the screen behind him, payments made by his parents, shared expenses, carefully selected timelines. Everything was framed to suggest one simple story. I took, and they gave. I listened. Quietly. Mrs. Carter benefited from the Carter family's financial support throughout the marriage, the lawyer concluded. She has not demonstrated independent earning capacity. The words pressed down on my chest like a weight. The judge scribbled notes, his expression neutral but focused. "Mrs. Carter," he said, looking up. "You've heard the claims. Is there anything you'd like to clarify at this time?" I stood slowly. "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "But not yet." A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. Daniel turned toward me, confused. "Not yet?" he whispered sharply. I didn't answer. Instead, I returned to my seat and folded my hands in my lap, forcing my breathing to slow. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure others could hear it. I could feel Linda's eyes on me. Sharp and suspicious now, no longer sympathetic. Richard leaned toward Daniel and muttered, "She's bluffing." Maybe they needed to believe that. The judge nodded once. "Very well, the court will proceed." Witness after witness reinforced the same narrative. Daniel spoke again, repeating that he never knew how much I earned. Linda described helping me manage expenses. Richard emphasized how generous they had been. Each word chipped away at the image of me in the room. I caught my reflection in the polished surface of the table. Calm face, straight posture. a woman who looked far more composed than she felt. Inside, doubt flickered. What if they twist it? What if they refuse to believe me? But then I remembered every late night, every contract signed, every tax payment filed, every record saved. The truth wasn't fragile. It didn't need defending. It only needed space. The judge finally glanced at the clock. We'll take a brief pause before hearing from Mrs. Carter. As people shifted in their seats, Daniel stood and approached me, his voice low and tight. Emma, this is your chance to stop embarrassing yourself. I looked up at him calmly. I'm not embarrassed. He scoffed. You should be. I reached into my bag not to take anything out, but just enough for him to notice. His eyes followed the motion. What's that? He asked. I met his gaze for the first time that day. Something you should have asked about years ago. He frowned, uncertainty flickering across his face. The judge returned to the bench and tapped his gavel lightly. Mrs. Carter, he said, you may present your response. I stood again. This time I reached fully into my bag, and the silence in the courtroom turned sharp. Like the air before a storm. The sound of my own footsteps echoed as I walked toward the clerk. Every eye in the courtroom followed me. I placed the folder on the table, thin, unremarkable, almost disappointing in appearance. Daniel's lawyer glanced at it and smiled faintly, as if already bored. That's it? He asked. No exhibits? No witnesses? I didn't answer him. Your Honor, I said, turning to the judge. These are my complete financial records for the past 3 years. Tax returns, contracts, and bank statements, all independently verified. The clerk took the folder and handed it to the judge. Daniel shifted in his seat. Linda's confident expression faltered for just a second. Richard crossed his arms, leaning back unimpressed. The judge opened the folder. At first, nothing changed. He flipped the first page, then the second. His pen paused midair. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear someone breathing unevenly in the back row. The judge adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the documents. He turned another page, then another faster this time. His brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in focus. Daniel's lawyer cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may. The judge raised a hand without looking up. One moment. That single gesture cut through the room like a blade. I felt my pulse in my ears. Finally, the judge looked up. Mrs. Carter, he said slowly, is this income solely yours? Yes, Your Honor, I replied. Earned independently through my business. He nodded once and turned his gaze to Daniel. These records show an average annual income of approximately $680,000 over the past 3 years. The words hung there, heavy and unreal. Daniel blinked. That can't be right. Linda inhaled sharply. Excuse me? Richard leaned forward. That's impossible. She never... The judge's voice cut through them, firm now. This income is well documented, tax compliant, and legally earned. There is no indication of fraud or misrepresentation to the court. Murmurs exploded across the gallery. She makes... How much? Did you hear that? Oh my God. Daniel's lawyer stood abruptly. Your Honor, we contest. You may contest later, the judge interrupted. Right now, I'm addressing the accuracy of prior statements. He flipped back through his notes and looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Carter, you testified that your wife had no consistent income and depended financially on your family. Based on this evidence, that testimony appears inaccurate. Daniel stood up, his voice rising. She hid it! She never told us! I spoke before the judge could respond. I never hid anything from the law, I said calmly. I paid my taxes in full, every year, on time. I turned slightly, my eyes moving from Daniel to his parents. I didn't share my income because every time money entered the conversation, it was used to measure my worth, to control me, to diminish me. Linda shook her head, her voice trembling. We supported her, we helped her. Yes, I replied softly. When you insisted on helping, when refusing would have caused more conflict. Richard scoffed. So now you're blaming us? No, I said. I'm correcting the record. The judge raised his gavel slightly, not striking it, just enough to restore order. Let me be clear, he said. Financial independence does not require disclosure to extended family, and silence does not equal dependency. Daniel sank back into his chair, his face pale. The judge continued. Mrs. Carter, Based on these records, the court finds that you were not financially dependent on the Carter family during the marriage. I felt a sharp, unexpected sting behind my eyes. Not relief. Validation. The judge turned to the other side of the courtroom. Furthermore, he added, the characterization of Mrs. Carter as a freeloader is not supported by the evidence. Linda's mouth opened, then closed again. Richard stared at the table. Daniel's lawyer gathered his papers with shaking hands. For the first time since the trial began, no one spoke over me. No one laughed. No one whispered. They just stared. The judge set the folder down carefully, as if it carried weight beyond paper. Mrs. Carter, he said, his tone measured but unmistakably respectful. Thank you for your patience. Patience. I almost laughed at the word. As I returned to my seat, Daniel finally looked at me. Really looked at me. Not as his wife. Not as a burden. As a stranger. How long? He whispered hoarsely. How long have you been making that kind of money? I met his eyes. Long enough, I said. To know you never wanted to hear it. The judge struck the gavel. And in that sound, sharp, final, undeniable, everything they thought they knew about me collapsed. Their certainty, their superiority, their story, all gone. And for the first time in that courtroom, I wasn't defending myself anymore. I was standing in the truth. The courtroom settled into a heavy, stunned quiet. The judge reviewed his notes one last time, then looked up. This court finds that Mrs. Carter maintained full financial independence throughout the marriage, he said. There is no basis for claims of dependency or misrepresentation. Daniel's lawyer opened his mouth, then thought better of it. Accordingly, the judge continued, all assets held solely in Mrs. Carter's name remain hers. No spousal support is warranted. A soft wave of murmurs rolled through the room. I felt my shoulders loosen for the first time that day. The judge turned to Daniel. Mr. Carter, inaccurate testimony, intentional or not, cannot be used to penalize the other party. This court does not reward character attacks disguised as financial arguments. Also sever. Daniel nodded stiffly, his jaw tight. Linda tried to speak. Your Honor? We only wanted. The judge raised his hand again. The court has heard enough. He paused, then added, let this be clear. Financial autonomy is not deception. Silence about personal income is not wrongdoing. The law protects individuals from being diminished by assumptions. Those words landed deeper than the ruling itself. The gavel struck. Court is adjourned. As people stood, I remained seated for a moment, breathing through the aftershock. The truth had done its work cleanly, legally, without spectacle. Daniel approached me in the aisle, his voice low. You made us look terrible. I met his eyes calmly. I didn't make anything. I just stopped covering for it. Linda hovered behind him, her expression brittle. You could have handled this privately. I shook my head. You made it public when you called me a freeloader. Richard said nothing. He couldn't meet my gaze. Outside the courtroom, the air felt lighter. Not victorious, just clear. My attorney squeezed my arm. You handled that with composure. The record speaks for itself. I thanked her and stepped into the hallway alone. For years, I had been told subtly, persistently, that my worth was questionable, that my work was invisible, that my independence was inconvenient. Today, the law said otherwise. Not loudly, not dramatically, just firmly. As I walked toward the exit, I didn't feel the urge to argue or explain anymore. The ruling had done what I couldn't do for myself for years. It drew a line, and on the right side of it, I finally stood unquestioned, unshrinking, and protected. The days after court were strangely quiet. No more lawyers calling. No more messages framed as concern. Just silence, clean and unfamiliar. I moved into a small apartment across town. Nothing fancy. White walls, large windows, a desk by the balcony where sunlight spilled in every morning. For the first time in years, the space felt like it belonged to me, not a version of me filtered through someone else's expectations. Work came easily again. Without the constant pressure of being watched or judged, I focused. I signed new contracts, expanded my client base, hired 2 people I trusted. The business I had built quietly, in the shadows of someone else's household, finally had room to breathe. People's attitudes changed too. Friends who once asked, "Are you okay?" now asked, "How did you do it?" Acquaintances who barely noticed me before suddenly remembered my name. I learned something important then. Respect doesn't arrive with explanations. It arrives with boundaries. Daniel didn't call, neither did his parents. And I didn't miss them the way I thought I would. What I missed wasn't them, it was the version of myself who kept trying to earn approval that was never meant to be given. One evening, as I closed my laptop after a long day, I caught my reflection in the dark screen. Tired, yes, but steady, grounded, no longer bracing for the next comment, the next judgment. I made dinner for one and ate without rushing. I slept without rehearsing arguments in my head. I woke up without that familiar knot in my chest. The label they had tried to pin on me, freeloader, had lost all meaning. Not because I fought it, but because it no longer had anywhere to stick. I hadn't changed who I was. I had just stepped into the life I'd been building all along, one quiet decision at a time. And for the first time, that felt like enough. A few months later, I ran into Linda at a quiet cafe near my new apartment. It wasn't planned. It never is with the past. She looked older somehow, less certain. When she saw me, she hesitated, then forced a polite smile. "Emma," she said softly, as if testing the name for the first time. I nodded. "Linda." We stood there for a moment, surrounded by the low hum of conversation and clinking cups. Finally, she spoke. "You know, you didn't have to do it that way." I tilted my head slightly. "Do what?" "Expose everything in court," she said. It was harsh. I considered her words, then answered honestly. "I didn't expose anything. I told the truth when I was asked." She looked away. "We just assumed." "That was the problem," I said gently. "You assumed?" There was nothing else to add. I wished her well and walked out, the bell above the door chiming softly behind me. No anger followed me into the street, no urge to explain or justify, just a quiet sense of closure. That night, I sat on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. I thought about the woman I had been constantly shrinking, constantly translating herself into something more acceptable, and I thought about the woman I was becoming, independent, unapologetic, whole. The court didn't give me my power. It simply confirmed what had already been mine. I learned that silence can be strength, but truth spoken at the right moment can change everything. Not by humiliating others, but by restoring yourself. I no longer needed anyone's approval to measure my worth. I had my work, my integrity, and a life built on my own terms. And if there was one thing I carried forward from that courtroom, it was this. No one gets to define you just because you stayed quiet. Sometimes, the strongest response is letting the truth speak and walking away free.